Well, with it being Halloween, I figured what better way to celebrate the occasion than by doing my very own top 10 favorite horror movies list. And I had a very interesting time putting this list together because growing up, I never really got into horror that much because I find the entire genre, much like comedy, to be very hit and miss. And much like comedy, horror can also be just as subjective because what's scary to one person might not be scary to another. And on top of that, you have some people out there who watch a horror movie for the sole purpose of being scared. I don't watch horror movies to be scared. I watch horror movies to be invested in things like plot or characters, like any other movie genre. Although, that all said, over the past several years, I have grown to appreciate the horror genre, even if I still find it to be very hit and miss. And I do apologize ahead of time if some of the choices on this list are a little on the more generic side. But with that all said, here are my top 10 favorite horror movies. Coming in at number 10 is The Invisible Man, the original, from the classic Universal Monster franchise. And when it came to picking a movie from this franchise, originally I had a three-way tie between this, Frankenstein, and The Creature from the Black Lagoon, but why I ultimately stuck with The Invisible Man over the other two had to do with the following reasons. Reason number one, while it's not the first horror comedy to exist, this definitely is a good example of very early horror comedies. And I do like the fact that the actual comedy portion of the movie is more on the darker side for a movie of this time period. And I do think the movie does a pretty good job of going back and forth between the horror and comedy bits, as demonstrated by, in my opinion, one of the funniest moments in the entire movie being the point in time where you have the Invisible Man stealing some trousers, riding down the road, singing "Here We Go Gathering Nuts in May," which I think is hysterical. Because up to this point in the movie, Jack Griffin had been terrorizing people, and the police are at their wits' end trying to catch him. And yet here he is just casually skipping down the road wearing a pair of trousers, singing this goofy song. It just cracks me up. But moving past that, another reason why I like the movie has to do with the special effects themselves. Because for a movie that came out in 1933, and watching it decades later, it's really impressive how well the special effects in this movie hold up. And on top of that, it really does showcase how groundbreaking this movie was with its special effects. Because you have to remember, green screen didn't exist yet, so the filmmakers quite literally had to have had Claude Rains wear this black outfit under his clothing and used a variety of compositing effects to pull off the illusion that he was really invisible while you see him wearing clothing. And all I gotta say is, 1933 was quite the year for special effects heavy movies, because not only did you have this movie come out, but you also had the original 1933 King Kong movie, which changed cinema forever. But getting back to The Invisible Man, another reason why I like The Invisible Man really has to do with the performance of Claude Rains playing the titular character, because in my opinion, he carries this movie. Sure, I do think some of the other major characters play their roles fine. Even some of the side characters, like the police constable or the waitress Jenny, are actually pretty good, but Claude Rains in this movie is the scene stealer, both literally and figuratively speaking. I mean, his performance, he starts out being sympathetic, but in a rude sense, and then as the movie progresses, he just becomes super maniacal. And there are points in time where, as I mentioned earlier, he can be hilarious, while also showcasing some more tender moments when he's around his fiancée. But one of my favorite aspects about Claude Rains' performance as Jack Griffith has to do with his maniacal cackle. I think it's just fucking great. And on top of that, it's also very influential to a point that Mark Hamill used it as major inspiration behind his cackle for the Joker. And another reason why I like The Invisible Man so much, again, goes back to the character of Jack Griffith as the Invisible Man. Because of all of the monsters that exist within the classic Universal Monster roster, he's easily the most terrifying of the bunch. Now, keep in mind, this is also the same roster that consists of a vampire, a werewolf, an undead sorcerer, a scientific zombie, and a prehistoric amphibious creature. Then you have the Invisible Man, who, other than the fact that he's invisible, he's just a regular human running around butt naked. And why I think he's the most terrifying of all the classic Universal Monster roster. First off, he's invisible, so he could be anywheres and you wouldn't know it. You can't see him coming unless if it's snowing or raining out. And on top of that, out of all of the monsters, he's the one with the highest kill count that lands within the triple digits. Compare that to some of the other monsters, I don't think any of them kill more than 5 people in their own respective movie, yet the Invisible Man manages to kill over 100 people in his own movie. Even if you were to watch some of the other classic Universal monster movies that feature all the other monsters and count the amount of people they kill in each of those movies and combine them together, I still think the Invisible Man would win at the end of the day in regards to having the highest body count. But honestly, the most terrifying aspect about the Invisible Man's kill count is his reason. Because you look at a character like Dracula, he kills people out of bloodlust. Lawrence Talbot kills people because he's succumbing to the primal urges of the werewolf curse. The Imhotep Mommy kills people because he doesn't want his ritual to be interrupted because he wants to reunite with his loved one. Whereas the Cars Mommy was ordered to kill people. The Frankenstein's monster, he either killed people in self-defense or he killed someone by accident because he didn't know any better. Whereas the Gill Man from The Creature from the Black Lagoon was simply defending his territory. And because of this, each of these monsters had some kind of justifiable reason that made them a little more understandable. With the Invisible Man, on the other hand, yes, he does kill one person out of revenge, but all of the other people he killed throughout that movie was unjustified. He just simply killed all these other people just so he could showcase just how much power and influence he had over people by causing this reign of terror, with the hopes that he could someday take over the world. Even when you find out why he decided to become invisible in the first place, it was a combination of his own greed, his ambition, but perhaps his most dangerous reason has to do with the fact that he lacks a moral compass, because he simply wanted to become invisible just because, resulting in him slowly becoming crazy over the course of the movie, feeding into his power-hungry nature, which is why I think the Invisible Man is the most terrifying of the original monster roster of the classic Universal Monster franchise. Coming in at number 9, From Dusk Till Dawn, a movie that the first time I ever saw it, I didn't like it very much, but the more times I watched it, the more times I grew to love it with each viewing, because at the time of its release, there was nothing quite like it. Sure, you might have watched a movie such as Full Metal Jacket where it goes through a tonal shift that's different from the first half, but From Dusk Till Dawn was different because it so much doesn't go through a tonal shift, it more enters into a completely different genre movie altogether, creating what I would like to call the hard left turn movie, in that sense where you quite literally have a movie that starts out as one thing but then it becomes something else halfway through. And this movie was really unique for doing that. Sure, since then we've had movies such as Barbarian and Sinners, which I consider to be pretty much a more serious remake of this movie, but From Dusk Till Dawn was the OG hard left turn movie. Because you get the first half of the movie, which is something akin to Natural Born Killers, if it had some Quentin Tarantino mannerisms added to it, but then you get the second half of the movie, which suddenly turns into this Evil Dead-esque vampire movie. And it's just one of those things where, on pen and paper, having a movie go from a crime thriller to this vampire horror movie should not have worked. And yet this movie manages to pull it off because we focus on one group of characters who appear throughout the entirety of the movie. Because if we had just killed off the characters in the first half of the movie and then suddenly replaced them with a new cast of characters altogether, I don't think the movie would have worked as well as it did. Also, this movie has a pretty stellar cast of actors ranging from some mainstream movie stars such as George Clooney, Tarantino himself, Salma Hayek, to some character actors ranging from Harvey Keitel, Tom Savini, Fred Williamson, and Danny Trejo, who clearly know the type of movie they're in, and they're all hamming up the roles and giving the right kind of performance that is required for their characters. Not only that, but some of the lines of dialogue the actors give are really fucking great, with maybe the best line of dialogue in the entire movie being the bit where George Clooney just says, "I know what's going on. We got a bunch of fucking vampires out there trying to get in here and suck our fucking blood, and that's it. Plain and simple. I don't want to hear anything about I don't believe in vampires, because I don't fucking believe in vampires. But I believe in my own two eyes, and what I saw is fucking vampires." Now, do we all agree that what we are dealing with is vampires? Even some of the one-off characters have great one-liners, such as that one Cheech Marin bouncer guy say, "You know what they say about me? I suck." Also, the movie has a great sense of dark humor to add on top of that. You also got some pretty great special effects when you do see the vampires. At least the majority of the time. Sure, there's some special effects here and there that are a little janky in some areas, such as the point in time where you have the girl kill her own brother and you have all of the vampires being depicted as these weird mannequins for a split second, along with some of the crude CGI used when you have the vampires melting. But I do find the jankiness of some of these effects to be a little charming. Also, you can't talk about this movie without talking about easily the most iconic scene in the entire movie being the dance featuring Salma Hayek. Because that dance is easily the most important scene in the entire movie, as the dance itself serves as a buffer that transitions the movie from being a crime thriller into becoming a horror movie. Also, to add on top of that, when you do see Salma Hayek do the dance, all I gotta say is, damn! But as far as the horror aspects are concerned, sure, technically being eaten or turning into a vampire results in the loss of your humanity conceptually can be a very scary thing, but I think honestly the scariest part of the entire movie occurs in the first half when George Clooney's character is wondering where the hostage is, and when he opens up the door and sees what became of the hostage, that to me is honestly the scariest and most disturbing part of the movie, because we have a shot of George Clooney just standing there looking at what became of the hostage, and the entire scene is just uncomfortable between his facial expression, the way the camera slowly zooms in on him. The atmosphere is also really uncomfortable, and although we don't physically see what he's looking at, we do get these quick edits of what became of the hostage, and what we do see is really disturbing, which plays into the whole idea of sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you physically see, it's what you don't see that makes it disturbing. And on top of that, a situation like that could happen is what makes it scarier. Now, that all said, yes, this movie definitely is very flawed in a lot of ways, but I still think it's a very enjoyable movie. Coming in at number 8, Mononoke, the movie, The Phantom in the Rain. And before I go any further, if you're wondering what this movie even is, allow me to explain. Mononoke the movie is a theatrical spin-off of the cult classic anime horror series Mononoke, which in and of itself is a spin-off of a horror anthology anime series called Akashi Samurai Horror Tales. And the best way I can describe this movie, if you're someone who's a big fan of the original Mononoke TV series like myself, this movie plays out like an extended episode of the series in the best way possible. But if you're someone who's never seen the original TV series, don't worry. This movie's narrative is very standalone in that sense where you really don't need to watch the TV series to understand the movie. Although, that said, if you're someone who has never seen the anime before, here's what the TV series is about. It's about this mysterious medicine seller who happens to be the master of the occult, who travels from place to place in order to search for malevolent spirits called Mononoke. And in order to slay them, he has to figure out the form, the reason, and truth behind the Mononoke to slay it. Or imagine The Exorcist if it was told as a whodunit murder mystery, and you get the same idea. But anywho, about the movie itself. For starters, much like the TV series, the movie also has this mesmerizing art style that has never really been seen or done before within the realm of Japanese animation, in which one could say that the overall art style to this movie is very avant-garde, given that the unique art style was heavily inspired by traditional Japanese art that flourished during the Edo period, with a mixture of Art Nouveau, while also incorporating a lot of psychedelic colors that are more on the softer side, while maintaining a paper texture that kind of looks like rice paper. And you have yourself a piece of animation that is literally a work of art, in that sense where if you were to take a still image of it and place it in an art museum, it would not look out of place. The art style of this movie is that good. But moving beyond the art style, as far as the actual narrative is concerned, there is so much going on in terms of both the actual story and the thematics surrounding the story. Because the setup to this movie revolves around these two women who enter a oku, which, from my understanding, is a brothel that houses the concubines of the emperor. And upon entering the oku, the two women cause a lot of unintentional friction within the oku, with one woman reaching to a very high rank her first day, while the other woman doesn't fulfill her duties, while the medicine seller is trying to seek out the mononoke that resides within the oku. And through the narrative, it explores themes of self-preservation, awareness, and the identity of women within the confines of the oku. Because one of the scariest aspects of this movie is the setting of the oku itself. Because in order for any woman to work at the oku to take care of the emperor's concubines, they literally have to throw away their identities in order to become a faceless cog within a well-oiled machine, as represented by the women who are literally depicted as a black silhouette. Say for a few women who didn't completely give up their identity to the emperor, such as our two lead female characters. Then you have the main central antagonistic force that's been killing people within the confines of the oku, that being the Karakasa, which in Japanese mythology is a cycloptic umbrella spirit that sometimes usually has a goofy design to it, although the filmmakers did a really good job of making the Karakasa itself very intimidating in terms of how it kills people, and the overall design itself looks really cool in a very abstract kind of sense. Not only that, but even before the medicine seller even figures out that the Karakasa is even killing people, in the first half of the movie, you see a lot of people utilizing umbrellas at various points in time, which not only serve as great foreshadowing for the Karakasa, but also tie into many of the movie's thematics. I mean, I don't think I could do this movie justice because there's just so much going on. Although I will admit, it is the kind of movie where you might have to sit down and watch it a few times to fully get it. And I also find the movie's narrative in general to be very engaging because, like I said a few minutes ago, the whole thing is a whodunit murder mystery, which I think is very unique for a horror movie. And I could keep going, but I think you get the point. Coming in at number 7, to my surprise, is Nope by Jordan Peele. And before I even talk about this movie, I probably should talk about my thoughts on his other movies, because when his first movie, Get Out, premiered back in 2017, I thought the movie was pretty good, but I didn't think it was this grand masterpiece like everybody else was making it out to be. Granted, I only ever saw the movie one time, so I have to rewatch it at some point. As far as Jordan Peele's second movie, Us, is concerned, I never saw it, and I heard mixed things about the movie. But when it came to this movie, I remember watching it with a few family members of mine, and by the time the movie came to an end, I was really pleasantly surprised by how much I liked the movie. Because I felt that I resonated a lot with the characters and the story in this movie as opposed to Get Get Out. And on top of that, I felt the social commentary was also handled a lot better in this movie than it was in Get Out. Because this movie thematically is about trying to capture the impossible shot for spectacle reasons, but not taking into account the tragedy that led up to the capturing of said impossible shot, which is literally what our main cast of characters try to do throughout the entirety of the movie, in some shape or form. And I do like how this movie subverts certain tropes of these alien encounter movies, with the first one being the fact that usually in these kind of movies you would have that one character who's really skeptical and doesn't believe what the main character is saying, and their whole entire story arc in said scenario would be them eventually believing in the existence of aliens and other supernatural phenomenon. This here, all of the characters believe that the UFO exists from the get-go, and does away with that type of character arc altogether, which I found to be very refreshing. And then you got the second trope, which is the UFO itself, because again, a lot of these alien encounter movies, the UFO is a spacecraft that houses a bunch of aliens inside, controlling it because it's their ship. This here, for the first half of the movie, you're under the assumption that the UFO is exactly that, a ship being controlled by aliens on the inside. But then, much like the main character, you too realize that the UFO isn't a machine, but a animal who's simply sucking up humans and horses alike to feed, which I think is one of the most original takes on UFOs we've ever had in cinema. Not only that, but the movie is not what you expect it to be, for the simple reason that you expected the movie to be a typical alien encounter movie, but as Althoff from Movies That Changed Us put it, it's Jaws with a UFO. Not only that, but going back to the writing, I think one of the best aspects about the writing is the way they have the characters of Otis and Junpei be contrasts to one another, with Otis being someone who has a legacy tied to Hollywood. He's worked behind the scenes, and he's also works with animals, so he knows their behavior the best. Whereas the character of Junpei, on the other hand, he has no such legacy. He was an actor who worked in front of the camera before his tragic event, and he's not an animal person, which leads to his demise during the midway point of the movie. And speaking of which, the movie is so well written that the moment Junpei says, 1 hour from now, you'll leave here a little differently, and yeah, 1 hour later after the movie ends, let's just say I felt a little differently after watching the movie. And it's also one of those movies that gets better upon rewatch. And coming in at number 6 is The Blob remake from 1988. A movie that is a part of an unofficial trilogy of 1980s horror remakes, where the filmmakers would take a horror movie from the 1950s and give it a visually gut-wrenching twist, with the other two installments being John Carpenter's remake of The Thing along with David Cronenberg's remake of The Fly, and with The Blob serving as the third installment of this 1980s horror remake trilogy. And it's also one of the few times in which, in my personal opinion, I actually think the remake surpasses the original movie. So, why do I like this movie? For starters, the special effects in this movie are pretty top-notch, since a lot of the special effects in this movie are practical. And the way the special effects are used to bring the Blob to life, I think are really creative. And I do think a lot of the practical effects used to depict the Blob, I think hold up very well by today's standards, with the exception of some poorly aged green screen and stop motion effects seen near the end of the movie. And to on top of that, the way in which you see the Blob kill its victims, a lot of those kills are very gnarly to witness on screen, because you see the Blob consuming the victims in a very horrific manner in which you see their bodies slowly melt, which leads into some body horror imagery. But perhaps one of the scariest aspects of the movie isn't so much the way the Blob kills people. I think it revolves around the human element in relation to the Blob. Because in the original movie, the Blob itself was just a creature from outer space. Meanwhile, in the remake, the Blob is not an alien. It was a biological weapon created by the US government to be used against the Russians because of Cold War politics. On top of that, you also have the lead researcher, Dr. Mellows, who I can only describe as being very cold, in that sense where his top priority is to mainly contain the Blob at any cost, even going so far as to sacrifice one of his own men along with 2 teenagers and 2 kids in order to contain the Blob. And before the Blob's final rampage, there is a standoff between Dr. Mellows and Brian, and Dr. Mellows during the sequence points to Brian, telling the townsfolk, "Stay away from him, he's infected," in order to scare the townsfolk into covering up what's really going on here, which I think is perhaps the scariest aspect of the movie. I also really want to talk about how unpredictable the plot structure is in regards to its main cast of characters. Because the first time I ever saw this movie, you first meet the following characters of Paul, his best friend, and Meg. And I honestly thought those 3 were going to be the main cast of characters we follow throughout the entire movie, followed by the rest of the cast. Then about 1/3 of the way through the movie, Paul, who I originally thought was the main character, gets killed off early, which really took me by surprise because I did not predict that, which also set the tone for the rest of the movie, because there were some characters who I thought were going to get killed off only to not get killed off, while other characters who I didn't think were going to get killed off ended up getting killed off in some shape or form. Not only that, but this is just the kind of movie that cannot be made today for 2 reasons. One, the whole scene where we focus on Paul's friend making his date a drink just could not exist today. And the second reason, this movie had the balls to kill off a kid character, which is something that you do not see often. Coming in at number 5 is Cowboy Bebop, the movie. And this is probably going to be a surprise to a lot of people, which I'll explain why it's on this list. But to explain what this movie is, much like Mononoke, Cowboy Bebop, the movie, is basically an extended episode of a TV series of the same name. However, unlike Mononoke, Cowboy Bebop is not a horror series. It is first and foremost a neo-noir, or according to a lot of anime fans, a space western. And the premise of the show is about a group of bounty hunters consisting of a former gangster, a femme fatale, a former police officer, a hyperactive hacker, along with a hyper-intelligent corgi, who try to find work to live while dealing with a lot of emotional baggage that continues to affect them and the people around them in some shape or form. As for this movie, much like Mononoke, Cowboy Bebop the movie acts as an extended episode of the TV show in the best way possible. And much like Mononoke, you technically don't have to watch the TV show to get the movie, since the movie is its own self-contained story. And with that information out of the way, you're all sitting here wondering, how is this a horror movie? Well, allow me to explain the following reasons why I consider Cowboy Bebop the movie to be a horror movie. Reason number 1, the movie is literally set around Halloween. Especially that last act of the movie, considering that it literally takes place on Halloween, where you see parades of people dressed in costumes, and there's a lot of jack-o'-lantern imagery seen throughout the movie. Reason number 2, the main villain is a zombie, at least in a figurative sense, who dresses up as a warlock during the last act of the movie. Reason number 3, his plan is quite scary, in that sense where he wants to use the bioweapon to wipe out the entire human race. Reason number 4, there's a lot of political red tape that's going on in the background of this movie that is quite scary, in that sense where you have the government trying to cover up the fact that this bioweapon even exists, and will go out of its way to eliminate anyone that actually has knowledge of the main villain or the bioweapon in question. reason number 5, a lot of the stuff that occurs in this movie is realistic and could happen. Everything from a terrorist attack, bioweapon being unleashed, political red tape. The movie even opens up with a grocery store getting robbed by a couple street thugs, only get thwarted by our main cast of characters. And there is a scene where you have the main female character getting almost sexually assaulted by the main villain. And those are my reasons as to why I consider Cowboy Bebop the movie to be a horror movie. And I go out of the way to watch this movie once a year during October. Because to me, Cowboy Bebop the movie is a horror movie in the same vein as Die Hard being a Christmas movie. And before I go any further, I do apologize because for the next 4 entries, you're gonna hear me say, what can I say about this movie that hasn't been said already? Because the movies are just that well known. Although, that said, coming in at number 4 is Jaws. And like I said a few seconds ago, do I even need to explain why this is my favorite horror movie? I mean, it's Jaws. It's one of those movies that, even though it's based on a book, is actually better than the source material in a multitude of ways. Everything from having better written characters, having the movie not be as schlocky, and giving a much more bombastic climax than the book's ending where it ends on an anticlimactic note. And although the last third of the movie turns into more of a adventure film, the first 2/3 is first and foremost a horror movie. And Spielberg's direction here at the time was very meticulous, like everything had purpose. And also really good visual storytelling as well. Everything from the mannerisms of Brody to even having a really good usage of the color yellow seen throughout the movie, while paired with that really iconic musical score done by John Williams. And you also have that one scene near the last third where you have Brody, Hooper, and Quinn just relaxing on the boat. And that entire scene just goes through so many tonal changes. Everything from being unsettling to being humorous, upbeat, and then going back to being unsettling and scary again over a matter of minutes, which is really impressive considering that most movies go through a tonal change over the course of its runtime, whereas this one scene goes through so many tonal changes over the course of a few minutes. I mean, there's a reason why the term blockbuster exists, is all thanks to this one movie. And one of the few movies that I could say is much better than the book. And I do find the idea of being eaten by a shark to be scary, because it is something that can actually happen. But the main reason why I rank this movie so high up on the list right here is for the simple reason that Jaws to me was my gateway movie into the horror genre, more specifically creature features. And much like Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park, Jaws also shaped my taste in not just horror cinema, but cinema as a whole. Coming in third place is Evil Dead 2, or Evil Dead 2 Dead by Dawn. A movie that's one part sequel, remake, or as some people have coined the term, requel, but 100% Sam Raimi. For the simple reason that this movie is the definitive horror comedy. Sure, horror comedies have existed prior to the creation of Evil Dead 2, but Evil Dead 2 is really what kick-started the horror comedy genre. I mean, without it, you probably wouldn't get something like Gremlins or Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, for the simple reason that the movie does a really good job of balancing out the slapstick humor bits with a lot of the horror elements, no matter if it's the over-the-top gore that some of the characters go through, along with having a surprisingly healthy dose of psychological horror in the first half of the movie when we focus on Ash Williams. And speaking of which, several people tried to go out of their way to create iconic movie characters. Sam Raimi did exactly that with the creation of Ash Williams, or at least this version of Ash Williams, played brilliantly by Bruce Campbell, who gives a 110% energy for this version of the character. A character who's become iconic not just within the realm of horror, but within the realm of cinema as a whole. Also, the movie to me falls into the category of being a perfected movie in that sense where the original Evil Dead movie felt like a prototype, whereas Evil Dead 2, it felt like a more perfected version of the first movie. Kind of like how Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is a more perfected version of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I know that comparison I've seen very random, but I think you get the point. Also, this movie is just a blast to watch from start to finish. I mean, what else can I say about Evil Dead 2 other than groovy? Coming in at number 2 is John Carpenter's The Thing. And really, do I need to go into detail in terms of why I like this movie so much? Because it's John Carpenter's The Thing. What can I say about it that hasn't been said already? Because this movie just works so well on many levels. Sure, the main aspect of the movie that stands out to me the most is obviously the practical effects. They're very well done. The designs of the Thing at various points throughout the movie look both fantastic and grotesque at the same time. Great example of body horror, done incredibly well. And the movie also has good lighting that only enhances the practical effects during certain scenes. The movie also has this really good ominous atmosphere that's felt at the very beginning of the movie, and it just gets more creepier as the movie progresses. But what really sells the scare factor of the movie is a combination of the isolated location mixed with the paranoia that occurs within the camp, when you have all the characters trying to figure out who among them is the Thing, which leads to the movie's themes of paranoia in terms of how it could bring out the ugliness in humanity, no matter if it be physical or psychological. Also, the writing to this movie is just brilliant in that sense where it actually asks a few questions that don't get answers, and the questions asked are so intriguing that more than 40 years later, people are still asking questions about the movie in regards to who was the first infected, along with who, at the end of the movie, is the Thing. Seriously, you type in videos on the Thing, and people are constantly trying to give answers to those two questions, and it's fascinating, which is a real testament to the quality of the writing that's presented within the movie. And the more times I watch this movie, not only does it get better, but I always pick up new details as I'm watching the movie. And those are the reasons why The Thing is my number 2 pick, which is really surprising because originally when I was making this list, I for sure thought this was originally going to be my number 1 for the longest time. Even though I do consider this movie to be objectively better than the movie I have for my number 1 pick, I still stand by what I say about why I consider The Thing to be one of my favorite horror movies of all time. And before I go any further, here are my honorable mentions. Reanimator, Trick or Treat, Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust, The Shining, Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, Predator, and finally, Perfect Blue. And coming in at number 1 is a movie that, if you ever saw my favorite film from each genre tag video from 2021, you already know my favorite horror movie of all time, which would be 1990's Tremors. I mean, what can I say about that? Literally haven't said before, because again, I've talked about this on that tag video, along with a top 10 list I did a while back, discussing why I thought this was a better movie than something like A Quiet Place. And even though I do acknowledge that my number 2 pick is objectively a better made movie than this, Tremors to me just holds a special place in my heart because for me, it's just perfect. Everything from the pacing, the script, the acting, the characters themselves, the special effects are also great. Not only that, but the movie also does this thing where you have characters actually making smart decisions while dealing with a threat that's ever evolving in an intellectual sense. Also, the movie has a really good way of balancing out both humor and horror at the same time. And it's also just one of those movies that everybody was on the same page about because everyone just knew the kind of movie this was and just had fun with it. And those are my top 10 favorite horror movies. What are your top 10 favorite horror movies? And see you later and happy Halloween.